Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our program today entitled Firm Culture and Financial Services, How Research May Drive Regulation. My name is Don Andrews. I'm a partner and co-head of the Risk and Compliance practice here at Venable, and I was a former Chief Trust and Compliance Officer at Bessemer Trust. I want to thank you for joining us and welcome to our program. A couple of housekeeping items. We have a great crowd here of C-suite execs, General Counsel, CCO, compliance officers, and key compliance professionals on the webcast. The program is being recorded, and tomorrow each of you will receive an email that contains a recording of today's program along with the PowerPoint presentation and the related handout materials. So go ahead and feel free to share that with the colleagues and others who might benefit from this. Again, this live program is eligible for continuing legal education credit. So for those of you who are requesting such credit, please execute the affirmation that is included at the end of the presentation. We will announce the required CLE code at the conclusion of the program. Also, for today's webinar, if time permits, there will be a Q&A session at the completion of the presentation. So go ahead and submit your questions using the Q&A box on your screen. If there's no time for Q&A, you can still submit questions directly to the presenters, and we'll be happy to respond. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Chris Mohn, who's the President of the Los Angeles region for BNY Wealth Management. Dr. Scott Rigby is the founder and CEO of Immersive Inc., and my partner, Michael Manley at Venable, who's a former General Counsel and CCO at a number of operating and financial services companies. If you like more information on our bios, the contact information is located at the end of the presentation. So I'd like to get started here and give you a roadmap of where we're going to be going in this presentation. We're going to start out with a definition of what culture is, and then some of the indicators out there of what firm culture should be from FINRA's Culture Survey, and then really going over more to the implementation side, what firms can do to achieve and maintain a good culture, and how financial institutions should walk the walk and talk the talk, and finally a discussion at the end on whether or not culture can in fact be regulated. So I'm going to turn things over to my partner Michael Manley at this point, and I'm going to start it by asking Michael, what is culture in the first place?
Thank you, Don, and welcome to everyone who is attending the program. You know, there are literally hundreds of definitions of culture that have been articulated over the years. We've put a few of these on the slides, which I'm not going to read, but in each case, they focus on behavior and they focus on values. And those are two of the key points that you're going to see in some of the things that we're talking about today that are articulated by regulators. What I'd like to do is, using that as the backdrop, jump right into some of the things that we've been monitoring on behalf of our clients in the industry, which is for the last 12 months or so, there's been a more coverage, more discussion, more dialogue about firm culture and its importance in the context of driving behavior and also facilitating a culture of compliance for various organizations. This is not just limited to the financial services industry, but of course we're focusing on regulators of financial services companies today. If you go to the next slide, FINRA in early part of 2016 issued their culture survey, which I'll get into in a little bit in a moment. But in that context, they announced 5 indicators of firm culture. And again, if you just go back to slide, these 5 indicators, we've tried to highlight some of the key sort of takeaways. They want to talk or look at whether control functions are valued, whether breaches of policies or controls are tolerated, whether you're proactively identifying risks and compliance events. And maybe even more interestingly, they started to look at, whether the managers, and this isn't just top-level managers, middle managers, are effective role models. And finally, whether there are non-conforming subcultures that have been identified in the organization and what firms are doing to address those. For those of you who work at some of the larger broker-dealers, if we go to the next slide, this is a quick summary of what FINRA's culture survey actually was requesting from a number of broker-dealers in the industry. What key policies do you have that establish cultural values? What processes are employed by management in communicating these values? How do the firms assess and measure the impact of cultural values? What are the processes used to identify breaches? How are those breaches addressed? Again, how do you identify and address non-conforming subcultures? What are your compensation practices? And finally, what criteria are you used to determine promotions?
If I can ask Chris at this point, what are you seeing, in your position there? I would imagine culture is a pretty big important part of what you do.
Sure. Thanks, Don. So we see culture is a thread that runs throughout our organization. It's important to our risk management practice, but we define it as within the firm, is our internal compass that guides the behavior of our employees. So we have an expectation, and we set the expectation from the top that there are certain behaviors that when someone's operating within or outside of the firm's formal risk framework, and it's part of every communication that we have. It's part of our, it's woven into our policies. It's a very important part of our process. So the risk awareness, the communication, the openness that we have, constructively challenging one another, it's woven throughout not only our, as Michael went through the culture survey, our processes, our policies, our compensation practice, and our promotion practice. It's an important part of what we do, Don.
Well, with that, I think that FINRA has provided some clues on what we should be doing. I want to turn back to Michael in terms of that.
Yeah, so what we've tried to do for folks, both our clients and people on the phone, is distill this dialogue that has been occurring over the last 12 months. The next 3 slides are giving you the clues, the breadcrumb trail, the information or the guidance that we've received from both domestic and international regulators. So first, on the slide it's up right now, FINRA's clues. They've got 4 categories which they feel are important to achieve and maintain a good culture. What are these institutional messages that are coming from the top, from the organization? What analysis and controls are you utilizing to monitor behavior? What evaluation are you doing of human capital? And one thing that they articulated is that they want to see how these evaluations are helping you avoid negative culture carriers that can infect in an organization. And then finally, what thoughtful review of potential conflicts might have occurred with respect to compensation and your program and your hiring and your termination. So if you move to the next slide, the SEC has articulated, and this is a very important point that Chris already alluded to, is that culture is part of risk management. This should be part of your overall risk program, not necessarily just a compliance program. And again, they also reinforce that it affects hiring, compensation, promotion, discipline, etc., for not only individual moments of compliance, but consistency across the board. How are you monitoring or surveilling this behavior? How are you addressing behavior that's inconsistent? And then finally, they tie it to governance, which relates to boards of directors, senior management, and how they are being informed about what's going on within the organization. And then finally, just to talk about it in the context of the international view, we've been monitoring some of the things going on in the UK, and the FCA and some of their executives have articulated some specific components or areas. So here on the slide, 4 components to good culture, rules and standards. The second one I think is really important is an detailed understanding of the business. In order to have culture inform good behavior and good compliance, it requires really good understanding of the business, effective systems and controls, and a regular review. And then finally, 4 areas leaders can use to shape culture. Tone at the top is a familiar theme that we're all have been, I think, part of our compliance programs for years. But they also say now it's also should be coming from middle managers, which I think is a little bit of a of a different spin on that area. What are the practices to ensure that the right people are employed and actually rise to leadership? And what are the narratives explaining what the firm is trying to achieve, and then what are the capabilities of the organization? I'll say one more thing on the narrative, and then turn it back to Don to invite others to comment. In the businesses that I've worked with, some of the best ones have clearly articulated their vision, their mission, and their strategy throughout the organization. And I think what we're starting to see here is that the regulators are expecting that culture become part of that discussion and that communication.
Thanks, Michael. Before I turn it over to Chris for an industry view, I wanted to just get an assessment from Scott, as a professional in this field. Culture has been a big deal, I think, in other businesses, other industries, and I think it's a relatively new type of a pronouncement in the financial services industry. I want to just get your assessment of what you're hearing so far.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. This is all, every industry has its unique issues, but a lot of the things that are being asked for here are entirely measurable and understandable in ways that can be functional for businesses in financial services the way it is in other industries as well. As I'm looking at a lot of these terms and you guys are outlining the problem, I see a lot of things like, negative culture carriers and values and things that really are not well defined. And I would imagine that in what I see in other industries is that creating a little bit of a feeling of incompetence about, well, what does that really mean? How do we operationalize it, measure it? I'm going to get into some overviews of what that is, but the good news is that these things have been operationalized and measured. They can be tracked. They have positive impacts, and so there's frameworks that can be taught and learned to great effect.
And Chris, it sounds like you've got a pretty good head start in terms of where you are and where you sit. What's your assessment of what you've heard?
So we had to have a head start out in about 2014 in the UK, as Mike alluded to earlier. This was an issue, and the regulators focused in on it. They're very actively measuring culture within all organizations in the UK, and they've been doing so for a couple of years. They have a methodology, so we had to adapt and embrace, and it was a part of our culture. And one of the things that Don, you had mentioned leading into the call was some of the things that we're doing. What specifically, and I looked at, if you go through each of our individual business groups, whether in the UK, EMEA, Latin America, or Asia, you'll find that each one of these business units, we have training videos. We have internal sites for employees to visit, message boards, ways for them to communicate. So we have that 360-degree communication on risk. We've designated individuals, and we actually call them risk culture champions throughout the firm. And each one of our business units internationally has them, and here in the U.S. as well. We have workshops that we have online. We've invested a significant amount of energy and intellectual capital and resources around educating our employees, promoting a strong and sound risk culture, but also encouraging that 360-degree feedback. So when you talk about earlier setting a tone from the top, when all of this was coming out in the UK, we worked very hard to make sure that we had those practices in place and a process to not only promote it, but ensure that it was part of our culture.
Great. I think a lot of folks that are on the line are dealing with the whole problem of implementation. And in terms of how is it that I'm going to take what I hear back today and create an effective program, and on top of all the other things I have to do from a regulatory standpoint, I'm going to add this to the list and need to do one more. And so, with that, Scott, I want to turn it over to you because you really do have sort of a measuring stick and how to get at this. So why don't you take us through what your thoughts are?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Don. Yeah, so I want to start out with some very encouraging things. As a matter of fact, I think that's the main takeaway right out of the gate is these things are all solvable, and they can not only benefit with respect to the regulatory environment, but also to the performance of the firm itself. And this is what we see in all of the data. We've been looking at these issues for about 30 years now, and have a tremendous amount of data showing efficacy. And so I want to start just with this idea that goals can be cultural goals can be quantified and they can be quantified in actionable ways. And just as importantly, they are predictive of things such as reducing risk, increasing compliance, increasing performance. And I call that out because in our work, we do a lot of work also in HR around issues related to some of the things that Chris was talking about, which is how do you do employee engagement surveys, but more importantly, what does engagement mean and what are the things to measure there? When you're a champion, what does being a champion mean? What are the things you need to be tracking there? And what we find when we talk to companies about their efforts is that if you ask how are you measuring this against outcomes, that a lot of times there are these initiatives, but there are not as strong ties to outcomes as I would expect to see in most businesses. In this case, the things I'm going to go over are directly tied to moving the needle on important outcomes. I want to go over one key anchor point or tentpole for my comments, and that is to think a little bit about motivation and motivational quality. When we think about motivation, most people think about it in terms of more or less. Or am I motivated or am I not motivated? The challenge, of course, is that doesn't say anything about whether it's good or bad or motivation or not. There are lots of people out there who have done very bad things that you would say are very highly motivated. Batman and the Joker are both highly motivated. That doesn't mean that the quality of that motivation is good. So it really makes logical sense. Ethical behavior is not a function of how much motivation, it's a function of the quality of that motivation. So then it becomes, wow, if we could measure the quality of motivation, now I can actually have a cultural barometer and what's going on exactly the issues that are being brought up by regulators. And so we have spent a lot of time measuring in a quantifiable way different motivational states. And I'll put this chart up here. It's a lot to digest. People can stare at it later. I'm just going to walk through it quickly. But essentially, what I'm outlining here is a continuum of motivational quality. This is empirically based, scientifically validated, and predictive of outcomes that we're all focused on here today. In some ways, you could think about it as when you have your cholesterol checked. When you have your cholesterol checked, you're going to see good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, all these numbers. We can do the same thing with motivational quality in quantifiable ways. So we can look at external or bad quality motivation. Essentially, we move on the continuum here from bad to good motivation. External motivation is low quality. That's when we're motivated by external demands or rewards. And I would think that would be particularly salient because that's a lot of the mechanics of this industry, right? Compensation systems, which was called out directly by FINRA, and that's direct focus, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, involve rewards. But if they're not implemented the right way, it's a lower quality motivation. And as you move along, you see that we move to then internal pressure. That's if I do something because I feel obligated to do it. But that's a lot different than higher quality motivation, where I actually value the principle or the behavior that's being followed, and I integrate it. So if you look at this, we can measure each of these discrete things, and it maps pretty perfectly onto exactly the things coming from FINRA.
I want to turn it back to Michael for a second. Michael, in terms of what Scott is talking about here, how do you think this ties in with what you're reading about the regulators' expectations?
I think that's a good question. One of the things that is becoming more apparent is the remarks and the commentary that we're getting from regulators are giving us the information that we need to start making plans. So clearly there's going to be more regulation coming in this regard. We don't think there's any doubt about that. As to what form it's going to take, it's probably a good idea, and we would recommend starting to think about what you can do to address these issues to show that during the course of your next exam that you've not only been thinking about it, but you've been proactive and you've started to put some new processes or procedures in place that can help demonstrate that you care about culture, you care about the behavior that it drives and the values involved, and that you're being active in terms of improving. Because as Scott said, what I think is nice about the science here is that it's not just about managing risk. It can also help performance. And that should align with everybody's interests, regardless of whether you're the CEO or whether you're a compliance officer.
And turning to Chris, from a non-compliance standpoint, as driving a wealth management unit, what are your thoughts on what Scott's saying?
Well, I think that the motivational quality is extremely important, and it is something you have to invest a lot of time and effort in, because if you get it wrong, the outcome can be disastrous. And I think that, when you look across the continuum that he outlined, you're right. External behaviors put in place are going to they're going to have specific outcomes, and if you're not careful in the filters that you're looking to improve, then you're going to have some significant deviance from the intended result or the culture that you're trying to promote within the organization.
So Scott, why don't you return to the rest of the continuum and explain,
Well, we've had a chance to take a look at this for a minute. I want to turn a little bit to what we're seeing in relationship to the topics that are salient to what we're discussing in the webinar. Motivational quality, and again, I come back to the good news is that these things are predictive. So motivational quality, that continuum, as we measure it, predicts greater compliance and decreased risk. So we have data that shows that when you look at the organization, that when motivational quality is higher, when people are more, what we say, internalized, where they've taken these things in and truly do value them, we see more compliant behavior, we see reduced deviance, we see greater adoption of policies and procedures, and in the time that I've talked to compliance officers and heard about compliance, this of course is a major goal that's trying to be achieved. And also we see employees holding a deeper commitment to the organization and values. So people lean in more to the organization, to the values, and also to their jobs, which is why it's directly related to performance. I turn to the next slide looking at compensation strategies, and there's an opportunity here when we focus on compensation for this idea of motivational quality to become an important litmus test for compensation systems and plans. And there's obviously infinite ways that companies can create compensation systems. What we know from all the work in motivational science that we've done is that there are principles that you can apply both in formulating those systems and also measuring their impact with respect to culture. So just a couple of ideas here, and then we may want to have some conversation about it. The first one is that what gets rewarded gets optimized, of course. So if you can speak all of the greatest cultural, ethical things from the pulpit, you can have them in your policies and procedures. But if these things are not making their way into the compensation systems and plans, people will quickly figure out exactly what's being emphasized. They will do end runs around any ethics or policies in order to get to them. But more importantly, not more importantly, but the nuanced thing I want to raise here is that even if you create outcomes that have all the right language and are linked into ethics, you still want people to have a high quality motivation to achieve them. And the reason for that is people are very smart at gaming systems. So if you come up with a metric such as, we want to put customers first, so why don't we make one of the metrics, what's the average length of time customers stay with us and are loyal? I'm totally making this up on the spot, by the way. You could have those kind of metrics, but you still need to measure motivational quality for that goal. Otherwise, people will figure out how to play games to simply up that stat. So both things are incredibly important when thinking through compensation strategy.
Let me just jump in on that one, Scott. I mean, I've had the benefit of being a president, a general counsel, and a chief compliance officer over the years, and in some cases have designed compensation programs, and then have had also to monitor, compliance on the other end of the spectrum. One of the keys here, I think, is the industry is going to be concerned that the focus on compensation programs will result in a change the way people are incentivized in a way that could potentially blow up their organization. I believe there's ways to avoid that, and that you don't have to do a wholesale rewrite of your compensation system, but it's important to do it in a way that incentivizes the behavior that you're talking about. I'll use one that I don't think is going to be applicable to help us with culture, but just demonstrates how you can change it. So we had in one organization a compensation program which was completely commission-based, and each salesperson was only motivated by what was in it for them. And we found that it was driving behavior, sales behavior that we didn't like. So we created a new aspect of the program which was based on the division and based on the overall performance of the company. And we saw over time that created better thinking on how these salespeople would work together to win more business. That's an example of how I think compensation programs can be modified or tuned. And maybe, Chris, you might have an opinion on that.
Yeah, I would imagine, Chris, you've seen this quite a bit.
I've seen it in more as a consequence. So you have your actual compensation program, and then you have throughout the course of the year, as you get close to the end of the year, there are collateral or add-on or follow-on programs that will come in where perhaps you're running short of a goal, and they'll say, we really need to have, we need to have more XYZ sold by the sales force, to use Mike's example to go back there. And then, in the fourth quarter, and then you have, those are the danger areas that you get into. And, throughout the industry, we've all seen several examples of them, but, a small deviation, whether it's we need to have more products, we need to extend the life of the customer at the firm, we need to spend more time focusing on this one issue. To the extent that people are doing that out of that change in the plan and the fear that they need to do it or they won't be relevant next year or it'll affect their compensation or their performance rating, that's where you get into trouble.
Yeah, and that's exactly to that point where you just described it. That's why measuring the motivational quality in response to these things becomes so important, because you just described a situation where people are on that low quality motivation end of the continuum, but that will show up in these metrics. People feeling pressured, people feeling controlled, people feeling all these things. That suddenly becomes a barometer in order to check what's happening with their culture that can be proactively acted upon.
I think there are a lot of chief compliance officers and compliance professionals and general counsels that are on the phone right now that would very much welcome a proactive way to measure edgy behavior in certain areas. And I just want to switch gears for 1 minute and turn to Michael and looking at it from the president of a company. How do you think the stakeholders are going to react to this type of an approach to measuring culture?
Well, I think where we're headed is that, and we've seen some evidence of that, is that boards are being held more accountable, and investors are actually taking more interest in their due diligence process in terms of what are you doing about things like culture. This is only going to continue to be more and more part of the dialogue. So if you're the president or CEO of the company, I think it's important that you can demonstrate, yes, that we're aware of it, we're thinking about it, and here's what we're doing about it. And by the way, it's also going to be something that helps the company. I mean, I don't want to lose sight of that, is that it's not just about, we're going to have another compliance program. We're going to have another thing we have to monitor. There's a positive element to it, which we can show based on the science is going to help you do better, help the firm do better as a whole.
And I just advance to the next slide, Mike, on that point, because I'm glad you keep coming back to this, because all of the data that we have shows that motivational quality is a major driver of performance, that people have greater commitment, creativity, they perform better on complex tasks, they remain focused on mission and values, and they are more likely to champion the organization. You use the word champion, right in your organization, Chris, and that really is something that's directly tied to this motivational quality.
I want to point out that a lot of what I hear about this is that it could be the approach to this issue is somewhat generational, that the millennial generation intuitively understands that culture is a major driver of performance and take it very seriously. And this is an opportunity for the financial industry to sort of wake up and recognize that there is a correlation between the way you feel about certain things and bad behavior. And so, with that, I want to, if you could maybe spell out, Scott, a little bit more in terms of how you believe it's a major driver of performance.
Can I jump in before you answer on that? Sure. One thing that you said, Don, you and I are both former CCOs. So everybody on the phone wants to know practically how do I handle this? What can I do to improve? What's going to help us during our next exam, right? And that's part of what we're trying to talk about today. What can we do with respect to motivational quality? How is that going to translate into a program perhaps, or things that we're going to do within the organization. And we're going to, before the webinar is over, we're going to try to really drill into that.
Yeah.
So Scott, back to you.
So to come back to the question about performance, there are, let's just back up and think about it from an intuitive standpoint. If you are truly motivated to do something, you have a high quality motivation, you are going to lean into all activities more. You're going to work at them harder naturally. The example I always use is just look at a kid who plays. There is no external goal whatsoever. Just a quick story, my nephew, when he was 5, I spent 3 hours with him doing a Lego thing that took, God knows how much effort, because he wasn't old enough to be able to do it. And my thinking was the goal was to get this thing built. And when I woke up the next morning, we got it built, and the next morning he had torn the whole thing apart. He looked up with a smile and said, "Uncle Scott, I'm taking it all apart just so we can do it all over again." That's what happens when we feel higher quality motivation for something. So what that means is there's natural energy that people bring to activities which increases their performance. They also, by the way, in terms of a sell into stakeholders in a company, they're more satisfied with their compensation. They're more satisfied with their quality of life. The reason is, ultimately, compensation is about the things we want in order to be happy. Well, guess what? There's things other than money people want to be happy. They want autonomy. They want a good working environment. They want competence and growth. These are all things, even as I'm saying them, I know everyone in the room and everyone in the audience, because I've been doing this for a long time, these are all things that resonate for us and that we get energized about. And it's that energy that ultimately is driving more performance in the workplace. And so the great thing about it is we don't have to make an either-or decision. We don't have to take up a defensive position that this is for compliance at the expense of performance. It actually is a 2-for-1. And it raises both boats.
And just to be clear on this, one of the reasons we're talking about this is, Chairman Ketchum, before, his term was over, said specifically that FINRA going forward would be incorporating behavioral research into its calculus about firm culture. So this is why we're talking about it today and trying to come up with, good ideas about, okay, now that we know it's on the radar, what are we going to do about it? Now, other things that, we can talk about, a little bit later, what can you do as a firm? I would recommend, among other things, that, we be taking advantage of relationships with organizations like SIFMA, where we're forming either task force or working groups to try to become part of the dialogue, to work with firms, like Venable, where we're helping our clients come up with plans, to work with firms like Immersive, to be proactive and not wait for this to happen, so that, we're not being told what culture should be. In fact, we're demonstrating what good culture should be.
I want to turn to Chris in a moment and just point out that all this stuff that we told our children when they were growing up about liking your job, living your dreams, wanting to, be in a profession or something that motivated you and gave you some kind of real sense of well-being. I think what I'm hearing here today is that actually happens to be a tremendous boon to a successful business and a successful workforce. And so I want to turn to Chris and I want to say, now that you've experienced this and you've experienced the new generation coming into the workforce, is there a different motivation for them than there is for the baby boomers?
I think there's from a cultural perspective, there's definitely these are my own observations. We've got the people that I've had the pleasure of working with are very, very focused. They are aware of our culture. They're proactively, they're communicating. The transparency and the frequency of communication is one significant difference. If I were to point to one thing that would demonstrate that shift from the baby boomer to the millennial culture, it'd be that. I think we've got a group of employees who are embracing it, who are communicating, who, back to your example earlier, when you talk about a plan that has a potential negative outcome, the people I've had the pleasure to work with, there's full transparency. I'll get an email, hey, this happened, I'm not sure it's right. You know, and in fact, what we've done, Don, to kind of capture that is we've got a program that we implemented recently. This isn't all about punishment and catching behavior and how do we identify those outliers. We have a program that we just put in place called the Caught Doing It Right. So when somebody actually does catch something, makes a good decision, is a risk owner at a very low level or a middle management level, we reward it, we promote it, we talk about it, and we put a program in place to acknowledge it.
So, Scott, how do people in senior management, and I also want to hear from Michael on this, how do they utilize this in terms of engendering a good tone at the top and having it permeate throughout the organization?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that can be done, and one of the nice things about these sorts of principles is that they become guidance that can be customized to meet different leadership styles, different organizations, different sizes of organizations. But the main things are we now have some goals, some motivational goals, some emotional goals in the organization that we can impact and we can measure. And so there are absolutely principles, and we do whole day workshops on with managers and leaders on what we call being need supportive within the organization, which is making sure that organizations are supportive of key things that employees need in order to facilitate the internalization process around values. But just as importantly, the leaders, and I think this is pretty self-evident, leaders need to be perceived as authentically having the values that they're giving voice to. And I listened to Caught Doing Something Right. You know, Chris' example, I love that example because this is an example of the organization saying, hey, we're going to really value doing the right things, not just trying to police doing the wrong things. And so just understanding principles of what builds higher quality motivation, if you're a leader, is immensely helpful in figuring out how to both intervene when there are problems, but more importantly, how to proactively communicate and set up policies.
So, Michael, you're the CEO of a corporation. How do you utilize this?
I think it goes back to something I said earlier, which is the most effective organizations are great at articulating their vision, their mission, and their strategy. And, you know, just to use an example, one of the world's largest apparel, athletic, shoe companies, right? Their vision is we compete. Their mission is to make the best products so our customers are the best athletes on the planet. And then their strategy is we're going to build or make the best sneakers. Everybody in that organization knows that, from the CEO to the receptionist, and they can tell you that. That would be an effective way to communicate culture. So if you were to modify or tune the vision, instead of saying we compete, we say we compete and put customers first. And if that's the basis for then how that gets communicated from the CEO through middle management to the staff, I think you're going to see a lot of some of the motivational benefits that Scott's referring to.
And so now the regulators are saying to us, we are going to look at your motivation and we are going to measure it to see whether we feel it's good or bad. And how do you think it might be implemented within an organization to convince regulators that you have a good motivation?
So I'll take that first and then invite Scott and Chris to also comment. I think it starts with you actually have a communication program where the CEO is periodically on an annual, quarterly, or regular basis reinforcing that this is our expectation about our culture. That then you include a healthy training program which helps people understand how do you do the right thing. And you may already do some of this, so it layers in nicely so that the messaging it shouldn't even be deemed unusual. It's hopefully part of your culture already, but now you're just reinforcing it. And there may be other tactics in terms of measuring, which become very important from a regulatory standpoint, because the regulators want to see that you're measuring it and that you can document that you're measuring it. So whether that's a survey, whether that's focus groups, whether that's attendance at training, all of those things, you can show that we are doing them and we have evidence that we're doing them.
So, yeah, let me jump in there, Mike, because I think those are all good points. And we're actually out there doing this in the world right now, so I'll just sort of walk through the sorts of things that we do. First of all the things that I've been talking about today are measurable. We can get discrete scores for individuals in an organization, for both employees, for managers, around their motivational quality in their work. And we can then use that information in various ways. Usually we start out by doing a workshop or a training, not just with managers and leaders, oftentimes with the whole organization. One thing that we found is a key to people having higher quality motivation. I've used the word autonomy a couple of times. This is a basic psychological need we all have. We all want to feel that we're respected and that our agency and our autonomy are respected. When it comes to rules, we all have an initial, lean back attitude because, who likes to be controlled? But the important thing is, if I'm respected, if there's a process that's coming in, are you explaining to me the rationale? So rather than simply saying, here's our annual employee engagement survey, come in and say, here's what we're going to be doing, and let's talk a little bit about why we're doing it. We're actually going to be looking at everyone's motivational quality in the firm. Why? Because it makes you happier and more satisfied. It helps the organization succeed. It helps reduce risk. When you give those rationales, it immensely helps the transparency process that goes on within the organization. And so the next step is to deliver these metrics and begin to track them. We set up dashboards for companies. They track these things quarterly, monthly. We can do pulse surveys after significant events in the company so that we can look at what was the impact of that event. That then becomes informational feedback. It's not to be used in any weaponized way against the organization.
Sure.
It's being used to help support the organization, the leaders and the employees. And so that information then becomes this incredibly helpful process that, without even trying to say what boxes do I have to check for the regulators, you've already checked the boxes for the regulators. So I'm applying my own model here to this process, which is, let's not do it for the external goal. We'll achieve the external goal, I think, in a very strong way, but the reasons for doing it can be, we can have a much higher motivational quality for it, which it could be about performance and for the good of the firm. These other benefits are sometimes what we call spillover or follow-on benefits, but those are also there. And I think that matches, when I read through Chairman Ketchum's comments and everything else, I think it matches the spirit of what I read. He said that, he used language like we should have a wondrous fascination, or words to that effect, with everything about culture and the deepness of it. I mean, the level of wanting to get to the real spirit and soul of what good culture is clearly indicated by all of that language.
So I want to turn to Chris, and you've heard what Scott had to say, what Michael had to say, coming at it from the standpoint of a sales organization, where obviously culture and motivation is a critical part of your success. How is it that you would utilize some of these tools or these methodologies that you've heard about today?
Well, I think we can all agree that if your answer to this this issue is to have the leader of your organization kick off your culture video and say, ladies and gentlemen, this is very important. I'd ask you all to pay attention, and point to that as your methodology for ensuring that you have a strong risk culture. We can all agree we're not going to have a good outcome there. I think it needs to be in the sales culture, specific to your question, we're in the risk business, and we take risks every day. We're expected to take risks, and that's how we thrive. Our culture at our firm, we have a conservative culture. We pride ourselves in prudent risk-taking, but we've invested a significant amount of time and energy in putting the strategies in place to ensure that the people, especially in front of the line in the sales part of our organization, they're out there, they're motivated, they are engaged, they're winning, but they're also responsible, they're owners of the risk culture, and they're part of the conversation when they identify a new relationship that they'd like, or a new opportunity to bring into the firm. They're part of the conversation when onboarding that opportunity. Is this opportunity or this going to fit within this sale, going to fit within the risk framework of our organization.
And so, Mike, I want to turn to you and ask you to put your CCO hat on for a second. And now, as CCOs, usually have a tendency to see things as half empty.
I can't believe that.
Yeah, you're utilizing this information. You may not find the results that you like. How is it that you can utilize this information to get the firm to conform to a better behavior?
So I'll use an example of what I think some CCOs may have faced. I was in an exam, and I was being asked. I was very proud of all the training we had done, and I was very proud of the fact that we had what I thought was 100% attendance. And without even looking at the material I provided, the examiner asked me, "Did your CEO go to this?" And fortunately, my answer was yes. But that was immediately where they drove in that exam to determine how they felt about, or what might inform how they felt about our organization. That's a very minor, micro element of what CCOs are dealing with. I think that this can be a proactive tool to help CCOs look at it and say, all right, there are certain things I can do that will improve culture. There are certain programs I can put together that will help us improve our culture. And by the way, maybe for the first time, I'm going to be looked at as helping drive better performance at an organization, as opposed to really having to manage risk. Because that's the main focus of compliance, is managing risk. And sometimes it's hard for you to always be the person who, when you are calling somebody, they're looking at their phone and they're saying, "Oh my God, what does Manley want? You're the CCO. He's only going to be calling me because it's something bad." Well, maybe this time it's actually great for the organization, because you'll be calling because there's something good that everybody can celebrate together.
So I want to turn to our last topic here in terms of whether firm culture can be regulated, or if you want, you can answer the alternate question, should it be regulated? And I want to turn to Michael first and get his view.
I think the reality is it's going to be regulated. Whether it should be, what I'm worried about is that the regulation turns into more about feelings instead of facts and science and objective standards. And that's why, we're promoting, being proactive. Our clients, the industry, let's be part of the dialogue. Let's do things so that it doesn't happen to us. Even Director Davidson of the FCA said, a good outcome is more likely if it is chosen and not imposed. I completely agree with that.
Chris, for the first time now, you may be in a situation here where culture is just not a factor in driving your sales, but you're getting that call from Michael Manley or someone like him within the organization who's calling you to say, "I don't know, I'm looking at this data and I don't like what I see in terms of your motivation, in terms of your sales organization, and I want to ask you in terms of the new regulatory type of requirements that are out there, how will this affect what you do, and how do you think that your troops will react to this?"
Well, as I said earlier, we're lucky and fortunate in that we had the opportunity to make this a part of our framework at the organization. So I'll turn it around and say that with this coming, if you're looking within your organization and you're thinking about that, the question you asked Mike, how, can culture be regulated? It can be measured, it can be improved, it can impact sales positively or negatively, it can impact the risk that people are willing to take. But the bottom line is you have to look within your organization. Look at the strategies, look at the policies you have in place. Did the CEO to actually go to and attend the risk culture education program that you perhaps rolled out? But you have to take stock of where you are today. fortunately, we're in a place where this permeates our organization. It's part of who we are, and it's already part of our risk framework. So we're in a good place. I think when you look at the what's coming in FINRA and the potential for them coming into your organization with a culture survey to measure risk within your organization and how you address it, I think it's a good opportunity to take a look at where you are right now and really make a strong assessment of how you're going to answer that question in that event, because I believe that they will come in and test it.
So Scott, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question with respect to that, because we all know it's coming. There's really not a lot we can do about it. So how do we get on board? How do we get ready? And what do you see in terms of developments and trends in this area throughout the century?
Well, I think that, I'll start with the last part of your question first, is I think this is coming for everybody. I think, you mentioned this as a generational thing around the millennials. I think that what we know from fundamental psychology is we all care about a lot of the things we've talked about today, but I think the millennials are one of the first generations where, for whatever reason, this is getting embraced and it's sort of coming. There's an opportunity to be the people that, are setting the trends and establishing the benchmarks as we go forward. I think that firms can do a lot of concrete things right now. So just playing off what Chris had said, we do cultural assessments. Get a baseline assessment of your culture. Take a look at what's going on. Have that information at your fingertips. And be talking to professionals like Venable, like Immersive, other people that may be doing this work, and understand what's going on. When we do those assessments, we then often will then offer customized training, because you have to know once you get data, you then have to know, well, how do I make use of this data to better the organization? So then there needs to be what we call a virtuous cycle between you need to get data, you then need to be able to react to that data, and then feed that back into training. And this is an ongoing process. And so the tools need to be there. We have these tools across all these different cycles, frameworks for training, measures to assess, and then strategies for intervention that we can begin to work with firms on immediately. We do it with a lot of other firms and a lot of other industries, and we customize all those things to meet the specific needs of the org.
In terms of what I'm hearing from the industry, Don, some folks have said, I get it. I want to do something about it. I want to be proactive, but I'm a little nervous about how to go about it, because suppose I do an assessment and it comes back and says I have a bad culture. Well, first of all, I don't think that that's going to be the yes or no, or the less, you are, you aren't, in terms of how that evaluation would occur. But there are ways to do it so that if you're concerned about it, you can cloak it, for example, under a privilege. As you use experts or you use other consultants, your counsel can engage consultants on your behalf, so that at least the communications and the report itself could potentially be cloaked under privilege, if that's something that's important to you. Some organizations may feel very strongly about that. Some of them that I've talked to said, I'm not worried about that. So, I think it's something that you should consider depending upon, your feeling on that issue.
Okay, well, I think with that, we want to conclude, but I'd like to point out that in terms of my partner, Michael Manley, he's written a number of publications exactly on this topic that are available through our fund forum. So, defining culture, can the firm culture be regulated? The SEC's echoes FINRA's focus on culture, and cultural and regulation, the international view. I think you'll find these of significant value. And with that, I want to thank everyone for attending and everyone for being here today.
Oh, the CLE, we have to announce our CLE credit.
And our CLE credit code is firm culture.
Very innovative.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.